You're listening to episode 178 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. David Loy and Ron Purser join us to discuss some Buddhist responses to popular mindfulness programs. What does mindfulness mean to you? Is it a 1/8 slice of a delicious Dhamma pie, or is it the full understanding and practice of Panya, Sila, and Samta? However we may feel about it, mindfulness is becoming mainstream in contemporary society and is fast becoming its own movement. And therein lies the challenge. What is this movement when we may not have a clear understanding of what is meant by mindfulness? The Secular Buddhist Association receives emails and comments on our discussion forums asking us to define more clearly what we mean by secular Buddhism, so we face that same difficulty of understanding. We've resisted articulating specific ideological points, relying on our guiding principles to promote a foundation for exploration rather than prescribe a dogmatic view. Secular Buddhism, simply put, examines the teachings and practices of Buddhism in the natural world. Our traditions and stories can teach and inspire without us having a dependence on accepting assertions that have a lack of unambiguous and demonstrable evidence. This approach allows for creative embodiment of the Dhamma rather than restrictive adherence to contexts that may not resonate with our own experiences in life. This provides meaningful impact to the individual, which in turn affects those around them and the rest of society. Not nailing down every point is an asset to continued growing and evolutionary development. Mindfulness may be in the same boat. It's an exploration, a starting point, and is something different than religious Buddhism. For those of us who are secular Buddhists, the accusations of watering down the tradition has become a very common noise in the background of being told we're doing it wrong, when we're not even doing the same thing. Perhaps, like yoga, a lighter form of a tradition will quickly take root in this new societal soil and eventually grow deeper roots. To that end, I'm pleased to announce that we will be starting a second podcast in addition to The Secular Buddhist. The Secular Buddhist and SBA site will continue. That's not going away at all, and our commitment to secular Buddhism is as strong as ever. The goal has always been to bring our practices to people who may not otherwise find them, to open that door, and while keeping that door open, we can also open another. The new podcast is called Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science, and the first episode will appear next week. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I invite you to look for Present Moment in iTunes next week, and I'll link the first episode on our Facebook page. We'll have many of the same researchers that have been guests here on The Secular Buddhist, with new guests to talk with us about mindfulness in schools, how it's helping at-risk youth, and various programs and research in non-traditional settings. As we do pass through the new Dharma door, of course, we want to understand and learn more about what mindfulness might mean in these other settings. Today's guests help us lay a foundation of ideas to bear in mind. David Loy is a professor, writer, and Zen teacher in the Sambo Kyodan tradition of Japanese Zen Buddhism. He is a prolific author, and his books include The World is Made of Stories, Awareness Bound and Unbound, Buddhist Essays, and the very popular Money, Sex, War, Karma, Notes for a Buddhist Revolution. His articles appear regularly in the pages of major journals such as Tikkun and Buddhist magazines including Tricycle, Turning Wheel, Shambhala Sun, and Buddha Dharma, as well as in a variety of scholarly journals. He is on the editorial or advisory boards of the journals Cultural Dynamics, Worldviews, Contemporary Buddhism, Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, and World Fellowship of Buddhists Review. He is also on the advisory boards of Buddhist Global Relief, the Clear View Project, and the Ernest Becker Foundation. David lectures nationally and internationally on various topics, focusing primarily on the encounters between Buddhism and modernity, what each can learn from the other. He is especially concerned about social and ecological issues. Ron Purser, Ph.D., is a professor of management at San Francisco State University, where he has taught the last 16 years in both the MBA and undergraduate business programs. He received his doctorate in organizational behavior at Case Western Reserve University. Originally from Chicago, he has returned to his hometown, taking his first academic position at Loyola University of Chicago in 1990. He sincerely started studying and practicing the Buddha Dhamma in 1981 at the Tibetan Nyingma Institute at Berkeley, and began formal Zen training at the Cleveland Zen Center in 1985 under Koshin Ogui Sensei, who had been Shunryu Suzuki's personal assistant in the early 1960s. After returning to San Francisco in 1997, he continued to study and practice with Zen teachers and Tibetan lamas, and recently ordained as a Zen teacher and Dharma instructor in the Korean Buddhist Taigo order. More recently, Dr. Purser has directed his studies to the Nikayas and Pali Sutta literature. His professional writings and publications currently focus on the application of Buddhist psychology and mindfulness practices to business, management, and organizations. His recent articles include Revisiting Mindfulness, a Buddhist-based conceptualization, Zen and the Art of Organizational Maintenance, Zen and the Creative Management of Dilemmas, Deconstructing Lack, a Buddhist Perspective on Egocentric Organizations, and A Buddhist Lacanian Perspective on Lack. Dr. Purser currently serves on the executive board of the Consciousness, Mindfulness, and Compassion International Association, the Center for Creative Inquiry, and Timeless Wisdom. He is co-author and co-editor of 5 books, including The Search Conference, Social Creativity, Volumes 1 and 2, The Self-Managing Organization, and 24/7, Time and Temporality in the Network Society, and over 60 academic journal articles and book chapters. He is an avid blues guitarist, songwriter, and Tai Chi practitioner. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice honey mint tea. Our guests today are David Loy. David, thank you for returning to the podcast.
Thank you for this invitation.
And Ron Purser. Ron, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. A pleasure.
So one of the things that's come up lately is a conversation around traditional Buddhism and mindfulness, and how those relate, and what some of the challenges are that we face. And the reason we're having this dialogue today is an article that you wrote that appeared in the Huffington Post. And for folks who are listening, I'm linking that on the episode page, so you can take a look at that. But what I'd like to do first is have you tell us a little bit about your background and why you're interested in this topic in particular. And David, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, my background is as a Buddhist scholar, especially interested in the conversation between Buddhist teachings and modernity. And also, I'm a long-term student of Japanese Zen Buddhism and a Zen teacher, some occasionally. And a lot of my concern is with what might be called social dukkha, the types of dukkha that involve institutions. Traditionally, Buddhism focuses on our own individual karma, on our own individual greed, ill will, delusion, and how those cause problems for ourselves. But especially in the modern world, I think we can see that those three poisons sometimes take institutional forms. And
as they become individuals with voting rights, yes.
yeah, take on their own motivations, as it were. And this is one way that it ties in with the mindfulness movement, insofar as mindfulness becomes integrated into things like corporations, the military, educational systems, and so forth. So there's a lot of overlap here in terms of what I've usually been interested in.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Ron, how about you? Tell us a little bit about your background and why you're interested in this topic.
Yeah, well, I am a professor of management at San Francisco State University. I've been there, about 16 years or so. But I started studying Buddhism in 1981. And as we all know, I mean, what is happening right now is that the mindfulness movement is really, really taken off. And from my perspective, I've done a lot of consulting work in corporations and have done things like team building and strategic planning and various other sorts of techniques. But I'm a pretty good observer of what happens in the corporate world in terms of when something becomes very popular. It becomes very faddish. And so I have a concern. I have sort of a concern about how we can actually have a deep transmission of the Dharma to the West in a way that still does not diminish its power, its transformative power, and not to lose the original essential teachings that are inherent in the Dharma. And I have concerns about how it can be diluted or decontextualized to such an extent that we kind of lose sight of what the original intention was, and it turns into kind of almost like a self-help technique. So that's really was driving my concern.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that, because that's much of the same theme of what's going on and is this a watering down, or what are some of the issues, came up in the conversations we had at the Secular Buddhism Colloquium at Berry Center that David and I participated in.
Right,
so this is very, very timely. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean when we use the term mindfulness. David, let's start with you. What is the context that you have around mindfulness?
No, I'm going to defer to Ron. I think he's done a lot better job, looking into the varieties of how the term is understood, including in the original teachings in the Pali Canon. So, over to you, Ron.
Okay, well, that's quite a daunting task, but I mean, let's go back to perhaps the terminology of mindfulness. I think it was an English Buddhist scholar, T.W. Rhys David, I think in the 19th century. Now he was really struggling in his translation from Pali or Sanskrit. I believe it was Sanskrit. But I mean, the basic meaning that he was struggling with was memory applied to purposeful activity in the present. I mean, that was his general understanding, and he was really kind of searching for a term. And I think it's kind of ironic, interestingly enough, that the word mindfulness kind of comes out of a Christian context. An Anglican prayer was that it reminded him of an Anglican prayer as to be ever mindful of the needs of others. And so he basically took what was an adjective and turned it into a noun, and that's how we've kind of stuck with that term mindfulness in the English language. But really, I think there's probably three main components, but I may just dwell on two. And I mean, we've heard, to be mindful, like to be cautious of something, like be mindful of your manners, right? You probably may have been told that by your parents if they were
many times and very ineffectively every time. Yeah.
Well, there's actually some grain of truth to that, because in that statement there's kind of an implication that we should remember something, So one of the meanings, of course, of mindfulness comes from sati, which does mean to remember or to recollect or to call to mind, and also to apply what you're what the instructions are. So in a way, what's interesting is to me is just the emphasis on recollection in the original meaning, the emphasis on being mindful of something. Well, what is it? Well, if we, from a more traditional Theravadan or Pali Canon perspective, it's to be mindful of the instructions of the teachings, and that includes, recollections of the past. And so, I think what's happened is that that we've kind of dislocated that meaning. It's sort of almost like the memory aspect has sort of faded as we've moved more into the technique side of mindfulness. So that's one aspect. And I think what's interesting too is that we could be mindful, and usually the object of mindfulness in the beginning is to be mindful of the breath, right? And I find that very useful because the breath is something universal. It's not Christian. It's not Buddhist. It's not even atheist. So, I mean, the breath is something we all universally share. However, I think how we are mindful of the breath or how we are mindful of the instructions are not all equal. In other words, we're making some sort of commitment. We're framing the task at hand based on certain assumptions of what we think the path is and what we think the goal is. So I'm getting a little off track, but so one aspect of mindfulness is definitely sati, the importance of calling to mind. But the other aspect, of course, is clear comprehension, actually knowing what's going on. So there's a certain sort of alertness that's brought to bear in the activity of establishing mindfulness. And then there's the role of ardency, the role of having the right amount of energy, the ability to know and discern what is unwholesome from what is wholesome, or what is skillful from what is unskillful, and being able to develop what's skillful and abandon what's unskillful. So there's a certain connection there that mindfulness has an agenda. It's not without an agenda from a more I don't even like to use the word Buddhist anymore because it means so many different things now. There's not any one Buddhism, but there is a real intention going on, at least from a more traditional understanding of mindfulness. And I think that that particular understanding is not necessarily what is being transmitted in what we see in a number of the more popular renditions of mindfulness in the popular culture right now.
And I'd add on, in that popular culture, a view of mindfulness is along the lines of intentionally attending to the present moment in a non-judgmental fashion with open inquiry. And that's kind of a nutshell version of how that practice is using the term of mindfulness. But as our friend Willoughby Britton has pointed out in some of her work, finding a consistent definition of mindfulness in that clinical context is a bit challenging. There's some variability there that also needs to be accounted for in the studies that we're seeing. David, let's switch over to you. I want you to tell us a little bit about social dukkha and how that plays into this conversation.
Well, first, if I may, if I understood what Ron was getting at there, another way to say that is that within the Buddhist tradition, mindfulness is something is a practice or a technique that's always done within a certain context. and that context is very important for making it what it is, and also is actually emphasized. For example, although we haven't talked about it yet, a very important part of that context would be sila, precepts, or the fundamental morality that's developed in the Buddhist tradition, which isn't it isn't just a sort of presupposition for the practice, but the sila itself is a very important part of the practice. And to separate that out from mindfulness within the Buddhist tradition, that would seem very, very strange and counterproductive. So that's obviously one of the major concerns that is rising right now in terms of the way that mindfulness is being taught and practiced, insofar as it's taken out of the Buddhist tradition and understood to be, well, I guess a lot of the concern is that some people would think that this is an extractable technique or practice that sort of gets at the heart, the essence of the Buddhist tradition. And the rest of it is sort of disposable and maybe can be ignored or even eliminated, perhaps because it doesn't really fit our postmodern or modern or Western situation anymore. So I think that touches on a lot of the concern from a more traditional Buddhist perspective or Dharmic perspective.
I would agree with that. It sounds like, and Ron, correct me if I'm wrong in this representation of it, is that in the Buddhist tradition, mindfulness and the practices therein and the way of living, that's all a part of that, including the full breadth of the Eightfold Path, is that there's an intent there. There's an intent to have a transformational change in how we live our lives. Might that be a fair way to put it?
Well, I think it's more than a fair way to put it.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah. And
I just made that up.
yeah, well, I think another way of putting it, to rephrase what David said, is it's not a one-factor path. It's an 8-factor path. I think there's some real issues about. I mean, one of the things that really intrigued me when I read about it, the idea of right view, right intention, all of the 8 factors. The term right is often, misinterpreted, or people think it's some sort of moralistic set of commandments.
Right.
And what I was really intrigued when I read a different sort of interpretation of the word right. The translation sama had a connotation to, believe it or not, music theory. Had a connotation to basically harmony. And so the one way to think about it is that we're really dealing with an 8-stringed instrument, and I play guitar. I'm a blues guitarist, so I could appreciate this metaphor. Is that if you're out of tune, you know it pretty quickly, or if you're only playing with one string, you're fairly limited. And so I think what's really interesting about sila is that this is not just a preliminary practice. It's not like, I think a lot of people also think it's like a linear progression. But in a way, it's a practice of the Dharma in and of itself, and it actually is a development of mindfulness at the same time. So in a way, the practice of sila, should be thought of more perhaps in terms of bringing into harmony, bringing into synergy all of the path factors, so that they're mutually interdependent and mutually supportive, and that is really, I think, the thing that's been overlooked.
Yeah, we're playing chords, not plucking strings.
Yeah, we're playing complex jazz chords.
Yeah. No, that's a great metaphor. I like that, because what often we hear, even in some traditional settings, is just do Vipassana. You don't need to worry about that jhana stuff. And to me, that always rings as, okay, so you're saying it's a 7-fold path. That doesn't seem quite right to me.
Well, I think that's another example of how the the decontextualization has stripped away. I mean, we're sort of enamored by meditation in the West. I mean, we think Buddhism equals meditation, period.
Particularly in Zen traditions, just by the very name, it's very much a part of it. And yet in some Theravada contexts, in Sri Lanka, for example, you'll find monasteries where the monks don't meditate. That their work is really academic. And
oh yeah, in the Tibetan Gelugpa
tradition, right.
The analytical approach to meditation, or the Madhyamaka debate style. That's not to say that they won't enter into a meditation practice at some point, but I mean, I think the Buddhist path is just so vast in terms of its various approaches. But I think there are some common ground in terms of the Eightfold Path as really a kind of a social glue across the Buddhist traditions.
Yeah. So that leads us to the social dukkha, bringing it back to let David talk about that some.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a couple of ways to go here. The Buddha didn't really talk about evil very much. For him, and for the Buddhist tradition generally, the fundamental duality isn't good versus evil. But he did have a lot to say about what's sometimes called the three roots of evil, or the three poisons: greed, ill will, delusion. And I think that's really the way we can understand karma in general in the Buddhist tradition is, when what we do is motivated by them, we create problems for ourselves and for other people. The interesting thing, though, is given the way that Buddhism developed in Asia, it was very limited in terms of how much it could really talk about social structure. I mean, none of the Buddhist societies or cultures was democratic. In order to survive and thrive, it really had to sort of walk a fine line and not challenge authorities. But I guess my concern is we can see today that we have something that didn't really, wasn't quite such a problem in the time of the Buddha, in that we have much more powerful institutions which take on lives of their own. That's one definition of an institution, insofar as it can even sort of take on its own motivations. So I've spent a lot of time looking at the way that, say, greed has become institutionalized in our economic system, or aggression, the second poison, as our militarism, or delusion in terms of our media, the corporate media. And so, I mean, one big concern about something like the way that mindfulness is being appropriated, say within the corporate world, is how much is it really helping to change the whole person? How much is it really involved in this whole eight-string guitar that we were just talking about a moment ago? And how much is it involving a specific kind of attention technique that can make us more efficient in our jobs, able to cope with greater amount of stress, and perhaps play a role in an economic system that has some very deep problems from a Buddhist perspective. I mean, if greed is you never have enough, I mean, I think we can see how we have an economic system where consumers never consume enough, corporations are never big enough or profitable enough or have enough market share, GNP is never big enough. And therefore, it seems to be something of a perversion to take out this one particular practice out of the whole of the Buddhist tradition and appropriate that, use it as a way to shore up and make people cope better with this system. Whereas, as far as I can see, Buddhist teachings imply some pretty strong questions and challenges to this kind of economic system. So it goes back to this whole question that some people have raised about, whether mindfulness could be understood from a Buddhist point of view as a kind of Trojan horse. This is how Buddhism maybe enters into the culture in an important way, but it's not completely clear to me, at least in the corporate world, which is the Trojan horse and which is Troy. How much Buddhism is helping to really get into the culture and have an impact, or how much Buddhism is being used to reaffirm and strengthen some aspects of our culture and our economy that are very problematical.
Yeah, that's one of the issues that we face is as we have even a particular practice, even out of that context where this makes you more emotionally resilient and able to handle stress better, that's not necessarily going to help address the causes of that stress. And I think what we're seeing quite often, particularly in a corporate environment, is the potential for, these practices will help our employees deal with anxiety, stresses, which they should be feeling based on the things that they're having to do. And that as we develop greater resiliency for that, although, yes, that's true, that is happening. There is a greater resiliency to the issues that arise during the day. Does that mean we're disincenting people from getting to those core problems that are causing those stresses in the first place?
Right. I wonder if we need to distinguish different contexts within which mindfulness is being introduced in practice. For example, Ron and I, because of his background and my interest, we focused a lot on the corporate world. And I think that can easily be extended to a lot of the military uses. I mean, I think we both be also very concerned if mindfulness is being used to help make better drone pilots that are used to kill people in Pakistan or Afghanistan. Whereas maybe we need to differentiate that from, say, mindfulness in a medical context, helping people deal with chronic pain, or mindfulness in educational institutions, where I think we can see it's playing a much more positive role. I mean, I think it's a complex issue, but that's one question that needs to be raised.
Well, and even more refined as we look at military applications, helping returning soldiers deal with PTSD is also beneficial.
I think that's a great function. I'm not sure that I'm happy with training soldiers ahead of time to make them better snipers and better killers. I think that's problematic. So it gets to be very complicated. Yeah.
It does. It's not an easy thing. We're very complex creatures. So between two soldiers, the main result of this is they become perhaps a bit more detached rather than having the Buddhist kind of non-attachment where you're not getting overly involved with something. They become detached and become a more effective killer in that fashion. And another soldier who flourishes in the realm, in their practice of compassion. And so they're much better at not pulling the trigger and having better discernment about when that is the situation they need to avoid. So yeah, it is very complex. You're right.
Mm-hmm. You've raised the important C word, compassion, along with empathy, and that's clearly essential from a Buddhist perspective. That would certainly be a very important part of the context within which mindfulness would normally have been practiced. I mean, the Buddhist emphasis, well, really the two wings of the Dharma, wisdom and compassion. And an extremely important issue here, of course, is what happens if mindfulness is practiced in a way that does not emphasize that? Is it the case that what we can see empirically is that empathy and compassion tend to be developed anyway without emphasis on them or an emphasis on sila? If that's true, that's extremely important, I think. But again, we're in very early days here. We really don't know very much about that, and I'm kind of excited that there is this kind of empirical aspect to the debate, that there's something here that can be studied, and we can learn something important about it.
Yeah, the sila, empathy, compassion being such foundational components to Buddhist practice. Let's go into this topic a little bit more. What is the value of teaching meditation a technique without those? Of course, from a Buddhist perspective, we could see that, well, then it's not really Buddhism, because those are foundational elements. We can't really have Buddhism without those. But is there still value in teaching meditation, the techniques, without those being explicitly called out? Ron, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's complicated. I mean, if we use perhaps, let's use the MBSR as an example, because that's really quite prevalent. And, I think a lot of people, I'm glad that David separated out the issue of looking at how mindfulness operates in different contexts. I think that's extremely important because obviously MBSR has helped thousands and thousands of people. I mean, we have no issue whatsoever with the benefits that people have gained from MBSR, reduced stress, reduction of symptoms of chronic pain and so forth. But going back to the idea, though, that without a moral framework or an ethical framework, I think what the danger we have is that what are the roots of mindfulness? Are the roots our contemporary American values, or are the roots something else? And so, if we're going to plant deep roots for the Dharma, rooting them in contemporary American values could be very problematic. And we hear a lot about Buddhism needing to adapt to the West. Buddhism, yeah, okay. What about the other way around? Ultimately, we should see social transformation as a result of the Dharma taking root in Western soil. And so I think the question, I think this aspect of talking about an integrated, holistic framework in which mindfulness is just one of many other factors really is the issue. And, so it's, on the one hand, the other argument is, well, if people didn't, if they weren't exposed to something like MBSR, they would have never gotten interested further. But I look at the yoga industry. I mean, yoga's been around. I mean, it's kind of on a curve a lot higher up than the mindfulness curve.
It's had an additional 20, 30 years of socialization and mainstreaming. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And it's I read somewhere that it was now a $1.8 billion industry.
I'm only getting 0.5 billion of that.
And, I don't see a lot of people after, practicing hot yoga suddenly, studying Advaita or going back to the Rig Vedas or the Upanishads, seriously becoming holistic yoga students. And so my concern is, I hope that trajectory is not going to be the same for these more decontextualized variants of mindfulness in popular culture. So that's something really I think we have to keep the dialogue going on that topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like the way you phrase that with the decontextualized components, because that's part of it. One of the things we'll need to explore is, and I know the MBSR folks, for example, would say, well, actually it is built in there. It's just not quite as explicit as we're used to seeing in the Dhamma. But we need to be aware that there is that potential, and that is happening with many teachers, that it may be being taught as a technique.
Well, yeah. I think as Willoughby Britton and David Vago have also began to, question whether the operational definition of mindfulness coming out of more of the clinical and therapeutic paradigm is really, sufficient in terms of the path and the goal of liberation versus the path and the goal of stress reduction. So I think there's another underlying issue here in terms of, what is it we're really trying to do?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, another way to articulate that, of course, is that despite the fact that Western Buddhism, and especially American Buddhism, talks a great deal about compassion and metta, I mean, Buddhism is also a wisdom tradition, and there's the emphasis on the personal transformation involved with awakening. It's quite clear within the Buddhist tradition that the most problematical form of dukkha, that's the word usually translated as suffering, is connected with the sense of a separate self, the sense of the self that feels itself to be sort of inside, apart from the world outside, and therefore can pursue its own well-being indifferent or even at the cost of other people and the rest of the world. I mean, Buddhism really goes to the heart of the matter and challenges that delusive sense of duality. And from that perspective, we can look at the mindfulness movement and really ask this question, well, how much by taking out this particular technique and practicing that, how much does the technique that's being emphasized really encourage us to look that deeply, or how much does it simply involve giving the ego more practices to strengthen itself and to make itself more efficient and more comfortable in the world? I mean, so we can say that there's value in reducing certain types of dukkha associated with stress and becoming more efficient for sure. But does the mindfulness approach really get at what Buddhism sees as the heart of the problem?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and this ties into what's the goal? What are we trying to accomplish? Are the results a bolstering and a reaffirmation and validation of the self? Or are we seeing more of a deconstruction and viewing the self in a more social context so that we do see that interrelatedness aspect focused on? I think that's one of the open questions we have, and I think we would also be challenged on the Buddhist side for us to make sure that our assumptions are even correct. Are these missing in the programs, or is that our impression of it from a distance? And I'm channeling our friend Mark Nickelbein, who would say it actually is built in there, and it's just not explicit. It's more implicit. And maybe that's a conversation.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to be a little more provocative, and I'll probably be misinterpreted by saying this, but I'll say it anyway.
Say it anyway.
I don't think the Buddha was interested in stress reduction. In fact, he used the word strive a lot. A lot of strive diligently. And the goal, if the goal is really awakening or liberation from dukkha or self-centeredness, which implies a radically changed perspective, it's not something that is simply a technique for the alleviation of specific ailments. And it's interesting that I think a lot of, at least how it's sold, is that mindfulness is often sold as enhancing personal fulfillment. And I'm wondering if that is overshadowing, as David was pointing out, overshadowing the wisdom aspect of really looking deeply into the causes and conditions of suffering. So on the one hand, there's some great benefit of making mindfulness more accessible and widely available, and I think that's a great development. On the other hand, if that's the only kind of route that this takes, I think we could be in trouble in terms of seeing the Dharma from a longer-term perspective. I mean, as you said, if this is a baby, the bathwater is pretty murky right now.
Yeah. We want to make sure that we're opening a door, but not to a very small closet.
Yeah, and I think some of us, I'm pretty new to the blogosphere, and I was kind of surprised by how acrimonious some of the comments get on the Huffington Post and even on the Tricycle online blog. But we've been accused of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I would say, no, we're trying to rescue the baby from drowning in a murky bathwater.
Yeah. There's the cherry picking accusation has come up as well, and my reply to that is, well, we do want to eat good cherries and throw out the bad ones. I think the problem isn't cherry picking. The problem is being dishonest with ourselves about the fact that there may be bad cherries.
Right, right. And I think that there's a lot of hype. I think that the mindfulness movement has been oversold, overhyped. There's no agreed upon definition. There's no systematic training that has any kind of shared standards.
Certification.
So there may be some certifications, but I'm not so sure if that's across the board.
Yeah, there's certification, and then there's certification.
Right.
Yeah.
Some of them are very, very robust, and I know the Center for Mindfulness, the MBSR folks, are stepping up their level of criteria and accreditation before one can be a certified MBSR teacher, and that they mean something very specific by that. It's not just yes, this is someone who can teach a program and say this is MBSR. There's an additional level of certification around that is very robust and does involve several years of work and training and really very significant review. So I am very impressed by what they're doing there, but there are also other programs that are really not what we might consider robust. We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm quite encouraged by that, and given that Ron mentioned the hype around the movement, I think it's worth emphasizing, and I think I'm certainly speaking for Ron here too, that neither one of us see that Huffington Post blog as the final statement or the final word on this issue. Rather, we both felt that mindfulness has really been, as he said, oversold and overhyped, and this was our attempt to sort of introduce another perspective. I think what's really exciting in a way is that it's still very early days, and what I'm especially interested in is, as I mentioned before, that we really don't know for sure what the long-term outcomes are going to be of people who practice mindfulness outside of a Buddhist or a spiritual context. It's very possible that what we might find is that a significant number of them find themselves moving further. It could well be, I don't know, but if we found, for example, that for a significant number of people doing this practice, that they developed a lot more empathy, a lot more compassion, that some of them, as I've heard, maybe even changed their jobs because they weren't happy with the kind of job that they had, then I think this would have really important implications, and it means something very different than if that doesn't happen. And this might bring us back to the differences between mindfulness practiced in the corporate world versus, say, in the medical world for dealing with something like chronic pain.
Yeah, it's interesting. Before we started our conversation today, we made mention of a recent study that I will also link for folks who are listening to the podcast. It'll be on the episode page, where people who had been through a program, they did an additional level of test to see what their empathy might have been like. And we're not saying it's a perfect study, and we don't know all of the details on it, although I'll be reaching out to the people who wrote the study to ask them to come on the podcast and talk with us about it. But there are some indications that doing these programs can perhaps result in an increase in some of the things we would want to see increased from a Buddhist perspective, like empathy and compassion. So that leads us to that question of explicit versus implicit, and how well you think people may grow into Sila without that explicit description of here's what we're doing and these practices relate to empathy and compassion and the samas in this way. What are your thoughts on that? Ron, let's start with you.
I think we are in too early of a stage of research to make anything definitive statements. I really think that we're still struggling with what are people actually doing when they're being trained in what we call mindfulness, or what is the operational definition? What is the practice? What are the measurements? These are all sort of quite contested in the field. I mean, I was fortunate enough to go to the first international conference on mindfulness, which was held in Rome just last May. And it was really a tremendous conference. John Kabat-Zinn was there, and many actually monastics were there as keynotes, along with many clinicians and neuroscientists. I happened to bump shoulders with Paul Grossman, who is probably one of the foremost people who's been looking very closely at measurement when it comes to measurement of mindfulness. And one of the most, I know I'm diverging a bit, but I think one of the most popular self-report skills out there, basically he's done studies and found that it really doesn't even have face validity. It really doesn't even differentiate. He doesn't even think that it's measuring mindfulness. You probably heard of that study where they compared college student binge drinkers.
Yeah. Yeah.
With,
they were every bit as mindful by that scale.
Right. Well, they were more according to that scale. And so I think we're still struggling with, overly simplified tools for doing this kind of research. We have widely disparate definitions of what we're actually doing. So I think it's too premature for me to really even comment on this in a way that I can feel confident about.
Well, in keeping with what David was saying earlier, and you've echoed as well, is that it's so early in this. We don't know how this is going to differentiate and what it's going to grow into. We have an egg, but we can't identify the egg. We don't know what's going to come out of it and what's going to grow into. And I think when it does, it's not just that we have one egg. We have, at the very least 3 baskets of eggs, shall we say, that we're probably not going to see. My prediction is we're not going to see just one definition for mindfulness. We're going to see several different kinds in the same way we see lots of different kinds of Buddhism. And so we may be faced with that sort of situation where we have lots of different kinds.
Yeah, and that's healthy. That's one of the things that drew me to Buddhism was just that its vitality and its creativity, its ability to have disputes and arguments actually between and across schools, within schools. That's happened historically, and I think there have been times when the Dharma has been in jeopardy, and we have reformers come into being, like Hakuin, or like Zen Master Dogen, who really thought that. David could speak better to this since he's more of the Japanese expert here, but I think this is really healthy in a way, to the extent that we don't jump to conclusions too quickly.
Mm-hmm. Mm. David, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, well, traditional Buddhism, I know it does have a particular goal, if you want to call it that. It's about personal transformation, and that can be expressed in a variety of different ways. But I think genuine transformation, if it is genuine, is going to involve practitioners becoming less self-preoccupied, less egotistical, and more compassionate in the way they relate to other people and to the world in general. And this is going to take some time. Mindfulness is just starting. The Buddhist path is not something that one normally completes or it takes years and years. It'll be interesting as things go along, the kinds of ways that social psychologists might be able to develop ways to measure those transformations, and also to notice whether different types of mindfulness practice, or perhaps as well mindfulness in different contexts, actually tends to lead to different types of personal transformation. It really is early days, to reinforce what Ron said, and it's a very exciting development. I mean, I hope that no one reading our blog will think that we're trying to diss it in the sense of wanting to refute or dismiss this from Western or American culture. Rather, Our concern is to raise these larger issues about how much it's actually working toward this larger personal transformation, and that's definitely a genuine possibility in some or many instances. I think it's a very exciting time. It's really, really early, and so in a way, part of what we've been doing is sort of trying to point out certain warning signs, certain things that we have to keep in mind as this process is continuing, to make sure that, American culture, which is so good at commodifying and incorporating everything, doesn't simply do its usual job on this one and simply make it another technique like yoga.
No, that's a very good point, because it's not to say that MBSR is a bad thing. We're all very excited by this and interested in it. In the same way with yoga, it's not that much of what we're seeing today is not very helpful to people. Certainly it is, but it's different than where its history, where it came from.
Yeah. I as I mentioned, I went to this conference in Rome, and John Kabat-Zinn was one of the keynote speakers, and I think I gained a deeper appreciation for where he's coming from, and he's really, really a person of high integrity, and but he made a statement in the journal Contemporary Buddhism. There was a special issue which he edited. He was a guest editor for, along with Mark Williams. And there's a quote here. I think it's a very important quote, and I'll read it if you don't mind.
Please, yes.
He said, I never meant the term mindfulness to be anything specific. I actually meant it to be a placeholder, an umbrella term for the entire Dharma. Now, when I first read that, I didn't quite understand it, what he was saying. In fact, I was a little. It didn't really sit well with me, because and he's made other statements that MBSR is the universal Dharma, and I don't want to go into that, but I think what he's trying to say, and this is at least my interpretation. He didn't call his program mindfulness-based stress reduction. He had a really specific intention. It's mindfulness-based. It's not necessarily mindfulness as the monolithic approach to mindfulness.
Yeah, that's very significant, because having been on retreats with John and Saki Santorelli and his partners at the Center for Mindfulness, they make that point very clearly, is that it's a placeholder term, and it's not meant to have been just number 7 in her classic counting of the Eightfold Path. That's not really what the intent is there, but that the use of that term, much in the way I use secular Buddhism, they use the term mindfulness. It is meant to be a reference to the whole of the practice, not one small component of it. And we often get tripped up on words. And I think what often happens is we use a term as just our temporary, and that pretty soon becomes ossified as the term that gets used and recognized. I think that's part of what we saw here.
Yeah, I think that's what's happening. And I know there's someone else out there that has issues with the idea of mindfulness as being a placeholder. I won't name any names, but less forgiving about that. I think he refers to it as a floating signifier.
Sounds very postmodern.
I don't know what that means, but it doesn't sound good.
One of the things that I've been considering as I listen to the both of you lend your thoughts on this is something I'm not sure we've considered because of our frame of reference. We come at this from a Buddhist perspective. And with that, I'm getting the sense that we have, and I certainly, this is one of the things I challenge myself with on fairly frequently, is the presumption of the position of privilege of traditional Buddhism, that's doing it right, and if we diverge from that, if we somehow separate out or do things in a different way from that, it's going to be less effective and less good. And yet when I see what's going on in Burma, Sri Lanka today, I'm seeing more effective use in these programs today in this brand new age just starting out than I've seen in perhaps the past 2,000 years in other countries that have not seen a complete ending of war. These are 98% Buddhist countries that have monastics behaving badly and not doing the practice. And it's easy for us to say, well, they're not real Buddhists, and we use the no true Scotsman fallacy to discount the data that is data we can't discount. If this is really effective in that traditional setting, wouldn't we not see this? But we are, and we're seeing it with every bit as much frequency as we see in other religious traditions with their monastics behaving badly. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Are we perhaps falsely and unintentionally, just from our own perspective, setting up anything that's not firmly rooted in the tradition as being somehow lesser? Because I'm not seeing the traditions as being superior right now.
I'm really happy you raised that issue, because I think it's really important not to make that assumption that sort of Buddhism has all the answers that we need, and therefore what we want to do is simply appropriate it completely. I mean, every time Buddhism has gone to a different culture, it hasn't just attacked the local gods and tried to supplant them, right? You think of Tibet, for example, but also China, right? Chan or Zen is really evolved out of the interaction between Buddhism and indigenous Taoism and to some extent Confucianism. So we see the same thing going on now. I mean, in a way, Buddhism coming to the West, or maybe we should say coming to the modern world, since the West isn't just the West anymore, right? Buddhism is engaging in perhaps its greatest challenge yet. And it's not a matter of simply Buddhism providing the answers. What's really exciting, I think, is the genuine dialogue and conversation between modernity and Buddhism, where each has a great deal to learn from the other. In many ways, Buddhism is a very sort of modern, it fits into the modern world, modern science very well in terms of emphasis on things like impermanence and substantiality, the deceptions of language, the sense of self as a construct, and so forth. But there's still an awful lot that needs to be dealt with. I mean, Buddhism originated in a very different foreign place in Iron Age India, right? 2,500 years ago. And the idea that we can simply adapt that kind of mythological worldview as a substitute for what has become a very problematical modern one in certain ways, I mean, I think that's naive. The really exciting thing is the genuine conversation between them. And in a way, we could say that the mindfulness movement, along with the sort of psychotherapeutic movement more generally, I mean, that's another important sphere of interaction. We have so many psychotherapists who are using Buddhist techniques in their practice. They are themselves practitioners and often Dharma teachers as well. But the mindfulness movement there is one high-profile place in which this interaction is occurring. And I guess what I just want to emphasize is I think it's important that it be an interaction. It's important that we not assume that one tradition has all the answers or even provides the correct worldview, and then therefore it's simply a matter of adapting and borrowing and using what we can from the other tradition. But we really need a creative process, which is going to take generations to see how these two traditions can help each other learn and improve.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you for that. Ron, how about you? Do you have any closing thoughts on this?
Well, I see some interesting parallels in a way, and maybe David can talk more about this historically than I could, but state-sponsored Buddhism, I mean, when Buddhism became the national religion, it was often done so for political purposes, really, to maybe subdue social unrest or and so on. So Um, I think that, the classic case that everyone talks about now is the co-optation of Zen during the war. The book Zen at War is often referred to for that. Um, we see that, you're not going to bite the hand that feeds you if all of your support is coming from the state. And it's very hard to speak truth to power when you're in that position. On the other hand, I see a modern equivalent of that perhaps happening in the corporation because we see a lot of consultants that are supposedly teaching mindfulness. I don't know to what extent they're going to call into question, some of the underlying causes of stress, some of the underlying causes of harm that are happening both within businesses, within companies, and what businesses do to externally. So I think there's some interesting historical parallels here. The example of the Marines, the U.S. Marines that was brought up earlier, is probably, an extreme case, right, of kind of a misappropriation of mindfulness. And look, these soldiers, it's not their fault that they find themselves deployed in Afghanistan. It's the policymakers who put them there. So, who are we to judge? But it does raise serious questions about the code of ethics, perhaps, for researchers who are, doing research on mindfulness and these sorts of applications.
Well, gentlemen, is there anything else that we would like to talk about before drawing to a close today? David, was there anything you can think of?
Well, just as a quick follow-up to what Ron was having to say, in some ways, I think the Buddha was a pretty revolutionary or a pretty amazing fellow when you look in particular at his attitude toward things like women and caste. But what happened to the Buddhist tradition after him? I think it became quite a bit more conservative. The male monastics didn't like the competition. They pretty quickly got rid of the bhikkhuni sanghas, as far as I can see. And also the states, the systems that you had, the social systems were hierarchical. You had kings, rulers, and basically Buddhist institutions made their peace with them. So Buddhism in Asia has not really been a force for social transformation. But now that it comes to the West, where we have democracy, more or less, free speech, human rights, and so forth, it opens up much broader possibilities in terms of addressing different types of dukkha suffering. And I think this is really one of the contextual issues at stake here, right? When we look at mindfulness, is mindfulness simply going to be used, picked out as a technique or a practice that just sort of allows us to go on much the way we are, or is mindfulness going to be understood as part of a tradition that I think has a great deal to offer a modern world in crisis, ecological crisis, economic crisis, political crisis? I see this as the broader context of the whole issue. Buddhism has so much to offer us, and yet Buddhism in its own way, as you were pointing out, it needs to clean up its own act. So I think we need to understand the particular question of the role of mindfulness in this broader context. And this context includes, let's be frank, a world in crisis, an economic system in crisis in certain ways.
Perfect. Ron, how about you? Any closing thoughts?
Sure. I would like to say something about going back to the hype and how mindfulness is sort of being oversold. And if we look at, the various corporate programs, and for that matter, the military, it's happening at Monsanto, it's being offered to Wall Street traders and attorneys, junk food industry. My question is, are these programs, are there any kinds of indications or examples of where this is leading to wisdom and compassion in terms of the type of products, perhaps, that are being produced by these companies? Now, is there that kind of critical questioning? going on. A lot of people are saying, well, the Trojan horse argument that mindfulness is a subversive activity, but I'm not so sure that. I think it's a submissive activity right now. As I don't see any evidence where a whole organization has been radically transformed into a more compassionate organization just through doing individualized mindfulness training. I don't even know what they're doing when they say they're doing it.
And I think it varies from one place to the next.
Right. And I think the danger is in this decontextualization. We think that tradition. We think that these are extraneous cultural, historical overlays. But in many ways, those are the aspects of the path that we might be most uncomfortable with.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we've had on discussions of the podcast before and on the discussion forums, that one of the challenges of cafeteria spirituality is that you pick out the parts that appeal to you and you set aside the ones that may be more challenging but are really the ones you need to do.
Yeah. And so I think that, no, I would not want a privileged tradition. I think that was your original question. But at the same time, I think we're a bit short on gratitude and humility towards where we're getting this stuff from. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you look at like China, the history of the migration of Buddhism to China, it took it took about 300 to 400 years of learning, Sanskrit. It took 300 to 400 years of really appreciating the Indian side of Buddhism wholeheartedly before innovation and improvisation occurred, and that was in the same pre-modern period. It didn't even have to cross from pre-modern times to post-modern times. So I think that in a way the DNA is there in the tradition. The DNA is there, and it's sort of a genetic inheritance that we're going to inherit. But I think we have to be cautious that we don't want birth defects to occur. We really need to have a healthy baby that grows up and matures, and so I think these deeper conversations about the context, the idea of how do we how are we approaching particular practices from one context to another. These are all sorts of issues, I think, that are extremely important.
Yeah, to use your metaphor of the baby growing up, we're trying to save the baby from drowning in dirty water. Mm-hmm. And that we do want them to grow up, and as a good parent, I would think we'd want this child to be their own person. And so I get a little leery when we talk about honoring our tradition in the same way that when I do algebra, or we see the mathematics of that continuing on, I'm not honoring Islam, which is the traditional root of algebra. And I feel the same way about these practices and these teachings, that they can be fully incorporated, but stand up and walk on their own without us having to be beholden to the historical context.
Well, yeah, I think that's inevitable.
Yeah. Something to think about. Well, our guests today have been David Loy. David, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ted. I've enjoyed the conversation.
And Ron Purser. Ron, thanks for being here.
Oh, it was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.